Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2021. This is a 5-month mission I'm embarked on with a bunch of other booktubers where we're reading Star Trek fiction. All the millions and millions of Star Trek novels that have been written over the months. We started in August with the original series, then we moved on to The Next Generation, then we moved on to Deep Space Nine, and I had a bit of a rough patch. Then we moved on to Star Trek Voyager. It was a lot of fun to reread a lot of Voyager novels. And now to finish out the year, we're doing Star Trek Enterprise, which was a show that took place a generation before Kirk and Spock, with the NX-01. The Enterprise is the first of its kind. It's just been given a Warp 5 rated warp engine. And in the first episode, Broken Bow. This is another Star Trek series where the show starts with the first episode. It's not that the first episode drops you into the action that's already going on. It's that the show starts there. And in the first episode, A Crisis on Earth forces the Enterprise to leave its berth to start its exploratory mission early. Before it's had phase cannons installed, so it has photon torpedoes but no other weapons. This is, of course, in a primitive era when the ship doesn't have holosuites, of course. It doesn't have replicators. It has a chef that we never see. It doesn't have force fields. It can do something called polarizing its hull plating, which deflects some energy, but it's not nearly as strong as having an energy field around you. It doesn't have a tractor beam. The transporter beam is extremely experimental. The crew itself doesn't trust it. But it does have a great crew. The Enterprise, this first iteration of the Enterprise, which when it first aired caused a whole bunch of fans, myself included, to raise an eyebrow. Because we already know, in continuity in Star Trek, who the first commander of the Enterprise was, and it was Robert April, not Jonathan Archer. Robert April makes an appearance in the Star Trek animated series. We're told that he's a legendary explorer, that he's made more first contacts with alien species than anybody else. And he was the original commander of the Enterprise. Also, in the original series, we meet people who were original engineers on the Enterprise, which wouldn't happen if the Enterprise had been launched when it is in Star Trek Enterprise. So you had to make allowances for that. I had my arms a little bit crossed mentally when I was watching the first episode until I saw that the first captain of the Enterprise has a dog on board the ship and that the dog is a beagle. And then I was on board completely. And when the ship launches prematurely, it has a Vulcan science officer. But she's not a lieutenant or a lieutenant commander. She's a sub-commander. She has a Vulcan rank. Sub-commander T'Pol is attached to the Enterprise by the Vulcan government at the behest of the fledgling Federation. And that was the show writer's way of getting around the often stated fact, that Mr. Spock is the first Vulcan to serve in Starfleet. T'Pol is not, she is a Vulcan on board the Enterprise, but she's not technically part of Starfleet. It's a bit of a hair split, but given the great chemistry involved, I loved it. The ship also has an alien doctor, Dr. Phlox, who, in a mistake, a rare mistake for the physical plant people at Star Trek, was given poor prosthesis. The alien prosthesis that makes him look like an alien was a poor choice because it's virtually identical to the prosthesis for Cardassians, the signature bad guy in Deep Space Nine. And rather than the showrunners acknowledging that, making it full Cardassian prosthesis and just saying this was before the Cardassians became bad, rather than making Dr. Phlox a Cardassian, instead they just, I hope you'll ignore it, the incredible similarity between the two, and give Dr. Phlox, he's a member of an entirely new alien species, the Denobulans, and he's played by John Billingsley, and John Billingsley is by a generous margin the best actor in the show, so you don't mind. After a few minutes, you don't mind. And later on, when Billingsley, initially he intends to play Phlox as a kind of jolly elf on board the Enterprise, but he drops that pretty quickly when he's given more meaty stuff to do, so that in some later episodes, you can count on Phlox to steal the episode if he has any kind of lines at all. And off we go. This crew of strangers, a couple of the people on board have known each other for a little while, but nothing like the long-standing relationships that we have in Voyager or some of Deep Space Nine. Instead, it's mostly a crew of strangers in a brand new galaxy. No ship has ever gone this way before. They're not equipped for the forces that they face. They learn that pretty early on. There's a great episode called Silent Enemy where they're just outgunned and need to do something about it. And the only problem, it's a great premise for a show. I still don't to this day understand why there wasn't enough fan support of this show to keep it going for 8 seasons. It was, aside from the original Star Trek, it's the only Star Trek that's ever been canceled. until the Kurtzman Star Trek in the 21st century, where they're all being canceled because no one watches them. No, you can't pay people to watch Star Trek Discovery. But if that's mainly, that kind of ratings disaster is mainly because the showrunners decided around 2015, 2016, can't imagine why, that they hated their fans and should never give the fans anything they know the fans want. So, and instead give them things they don't want. So if you have a suspicion that they don't want you to laugh at some Star Trek tradition, then laugh at them all. If you have a suspicion that they don't like dumb plot contrivances or silly Joss Whedon humor, then load every episode with that. Not because you yourself think that's a good way to go, but because you've somehow decided that you hate these people, these fans of your show. You hate them. You want to get them going. You want to outrage them. Without apparently seeing that the inevitable corollary of that is that they'll leave the show in droves, and they have. So we're not talking about the 23rd. We're not talking about the Kurtzman Star Trek. We're talking about, this is the last iteration of Star Trek that didn't have this one person's sacrilege written all over it. And I don't know why this iteration of the show didn't excite the fans enough to keep it going, because it's really good from start to finish. It makes a couple of detours that I didn't like, but by and large, it's fantastic. And the final season, when the showrunners and everyone else involved knew that the show wasn't being renewed, they hit episode after episode out of the park. But the problem with this is that Star Trek Enterprise was conceived fairly tightly right from the beginning. There aren't many air gaps between episodes, which means there isn't much room for novels. You have to be extra creative. And if you're given an 80,000 word deadline and told, can you have this in a month, you're not going to have time to be creative. I went to Two Old Hands for my first Enterprise novel, Enterprise by the Book, by Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush, who we've seen on BookTrek many times. They're old hands at writing Star Trek fiction. I kind of thought, maybe that would mean that's our crew right there. I kind of thought that would mean they'd be good at it, and they were. This is largely good. It's split right down the middle. I've noticed with a lot of their books, there are two plots that barely overlap at all. It makes me wonder if they just write separately and then just melt them together into a book. One half of the plot is about what the crew does in their off hours on a ship that doesn't have a gym, doesn't have a holosuite, doesn't have anything like that. What do they do to keep themselves occupied? It turns out they play D&D, a variation thereof, and that part of the book I could have taken or left. The only thing that would save that aspect of the book would be really good character interplay, and it's not their fault that they don't provide a lot of that, because there wasn't a lot of that. We don't know a lot about these characters this early on in the show. I think this was the first Star Trek Enterprise novel. We don't know a lot about the characters, so the interplay would be guesswork. The other side of the plot is hinted at the title here, is that they make first contact with an alien species that are extremely decorous. They do everything in an extremely organized and planned way. And naturally that leads to a diplomatic faux pas from Jonathan Archer, who's he's still new at this, and he's a little bit ham-fisted when it comes to first contact. And they need to make that right. And there's a MacGuffin that does link those two together, but it doesn't do so very convincingly. But even so, I kept reading. Absolutely, I kept reading. This was definitely enjoyable. All you have to do with this, is with any early iteration novel, is just keep in mind that the show had progressed from here. And the writers didn't know that. This is not simple writing on their part. They're doing the best they can with the very limited information that they have. So I think the next Enterprise book that I will read, I have a bunch of them. I think the next one that I will read will be a novelization from very late. And we'll see if that makes a difference. We'll see how much of a difference that makes. I'm curious to know. But anyway, that's my launch for Star Trek Enterprise for the last month of BookTrek 2021. I'm curious to know if you're watching, if you are a Star Trek fan, if you've watched Star Trek Enterprise. Do you have any thoughts on it? Are you pleased with it? I found that it's almost as much of a hit or miss show as Voyager. People who like it tend to like it a lot, and a lot of people don't like it at all. They just think the criticism I've heard from most people is that it's nothing to do with the acting. The cast is really good, but rather that this ship keeps getting the crap knocked out of it. They don't ever have any wins. I don't think that reading holds up. If you watch for instance, the first season of Star Trek Enterprise, which I'm doing, I'm rewatching the first season. I think there are plenty of wins. I think it's pretty interesting. But this Enterprise, the NX-01, is supposed to be an underdog. Very much so. It's not supposed to be the flying super fortress of the Next Generation. I'd be curious to know, if you've watched Enterprise, what are your thoughts on it are. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up before I lose the light. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.